The sky was thick with the scent of smoke, the smell of something burning deeper than just the land. The sun barely peeked through the murky clouds, casting a dull orange hue over the barren battlefield. The war had raged for what felt like eternity, but for Sergeant Jack Riley, this moment, this endless stretch of time, felt like it had no beginning and no end. Jack had seen it all, the horrors, the sacrifices, the smiles lost forever in the dark trenches of battle. And yet he still stood, his comrades huddled close, trying to find shelter where there was none, faces drawn with exhaustion, eyes haunted by the weight of impending doom. Jack felt the same exhaustion, but there was something else buried deeper inside, a force that was harder to describe. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was something far more primal, something that made the fire in his chest burn with purpose. "Stay sharp, everyone," Jack said, his voice hoarse but steady. He wasn't just giving orders, it was a promise, an unspoken vow that they would make it through this, that they would fight even if the world around them seemed to be crumbling into dust. The soldiers around him nodded, their faces half hidden beneath their helmets. They didn't speak. Words felt too heavy in a moment like this. Only the distant echoes of gunfire and the sporadic explosions told the real story. One of a war that refused to release its grip on the world. One of a fight that was beyond reason. But for Jack and his team, it was more than just survival. It was about each other. They weren't just soldiers on a battlefield. They were brothers bound by something greater than orders, greater than their own survival. They were bound by a bond forged in the fire of shared experience. A shadow loomed over them, a sudden rustling in the brush, the sound of something bigger than the wind. The enemy was coming. The attack was swift, unrelenting. The air seemed to thicken as the first wave of fire rained down on them, cutting through the silence like a blade. The sound was deafening. Screams of soldiers lost, the sound of boots pounding against the dirt as men scrambled for cover. Jack's heart raced, but his mind was cold. His training took over. He moved swiftly, issuing orders, pulling his team back, directing them to safety points they had memorized long ago. They were outnumbered. The enemy was overwhelming. They had no choice but to fight. But deep down, Jack knew that this was a fight they couldn't win. Not by sheer force, not by numbers, not by anything other than the will to keep going. "On your feet now!" Jack yelled, his voice snapping through the chaos. His words were not just commands, they were a rallying cry, a lifeline to his men. As the soldiers scrambled, Jack took a brief moment to look around, taking in the sight of his team. They were all there, strangers, brothers, sons, all united under the same cause. His team was small now, smaller than before. The faces he had once known had begun to fade. He couldn't afford to dwell on that. Not now, not in this moment. The first barrage passed, the smoke settled, and for a moment there was silence. A false silence, the calm before the next wave. But Jack knew what came next. He had been through enough battles to recognize it. The second wave was always deadlier. The enemy pushed forward with relentless precision, like a tidal wave crashing against a crumbling wall. Jack gritted his teeth. "Brace yourselves," he shouted, as his hand instinctively tightened around his rifle. He felt the weight of his duty press upon him. There was no turning back now. The ground trembled as the second wave of firestorm hit. Jack could feel the heat of the explosion reverberating in his chest. But there was no time to think about pain. The world around him became a blur of gunfire, debris, and the sharp, bitter scent of gunpowder. In the chaos, he heard the faintest cry, a comrade down, a soldier in need of help. Without thinking, Jack sprinted toward the sound, the world narrowing until only one thing mattered: getting to his brother. He found Private Johnson, a young man with bright eyes that had seen far too much in his short time. He was pinned down, blood dripping from a wound on his leg. Jack didn't hesitate. He dropped beside him, pulling Johnson's arm over his shoulder. "We're not leaving you behind," Jack said, his voice fierce with conviction. Johnson's face was pale, but he managed a weak smile. "I'm not going anywhere, Sergeant." With Jack's help, Johnson stumbled to his feet, leaning on his commander for support. But it wasn't long before they were pinned down again. The enemy's fire was closing in, and Jack could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The odds were insurmountable. The enemy was too many. They had no air support, no reinforcements, no hope of survival. But Jack wasn't about to let that stop him, not on his watch. "Listen to me," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the noise. "We fight here and now, or we die here. But we're not going down without a fight. Not today." There was something about his words that rallied his men. Their fear faded, replaced by the same fire that burned in his heart. The soldiers around him stood taller. They gripped their rifles tighter. They weren't going to give up. Not yet. The enemy closed in, their shadows casting long and dark over the small group of soldiers. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was ironclad. He wouldn't let them fall, not while he was still standing. "Get to the barricade!" Jack shouted, motioning for the remaining men to move. The soldiers rushed to their positions, firing in bursts, but they couldn't hold their ground forever. Jack could see it in their eyes. Doubt, fear, a silent resignation that told him the end was near. But even then, Jack didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the advancing enemy. As the fire from both sides intensified, Jack's hand moved instinctively, reloading his rifle, shifting to a defensive position. The battlefield became a blur of motion, men shouting, explosions rocking the earth beneath them, the constant thud of gunfire. And then it happened. A soldier no older than Jack's own son broke through the line. His face was covered in dirt, his eyes wild with panic. He was out of position, but it wasn't the enemy that stopped him. It was Jack. Without thinking, Jack lunged forward, grabbing the soldier and pulling him down just as a bullet whizzed past. "You stay low!" Jack shouted, adrenaline surging through him. The soldier nodded, wide-eyed, his body shaking. Jack had saved him, but at what cost? Jack stood tall, his mind sharp despite the chaos. Every part of his being screamed to retreat, to save himself and his men. But there was no retreat. There was no safety left. The only way out was through. The enemy was now too close, too many. Jack took a deep breath and steadied himself. This was it, the last stand. "Stay with me, men," he commanded, his voice strong, unwavering. "This is our fight, our time." And then, as the enemy charged, Jack did the only thing left for him to do. He fought. He stood alone in the line of fire, not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of hope. He fought with everything he had left. He fought for his comrades. He fought for the men who couldn't fight anymore. And he fought for the ones who would never get the chance. The fire from his rifle was the only thing keeping the enemy at bay. But Jack knew it wouldn't last. His arms were heavy, his vision blurred, but his heart still burned. The battlefield had turned into a furnace, the air thick with dust, smoke, and the acrid scent of blood. Every step Jack took felt like it could be his last, but he never hesitated. His focus was sharp, his mind a razor blade cutting through the chaos. His team had fought valiantly, but their numbers were thinning. The enemy was relentless, moving like a wave crashing on an unprotected shore. Jack's arms were heavy, his hands trembling slightly from the sheer exhaustion. His breath came in shallow gasps, but his resolve was unwavering. As the enemy surged forward, Jack could feel the weight of history on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for the legacy of every soldier who had given everything, for the promise that this moment, this final stand, would mean something. "Hold your ground," he roared, rallying his men. But deep down, he knew the truth. The end was near. They couldn't hold the line forever. The enemy's fire grew more intense, more focused. Jack's soldiers were falling one by one, the battlefield slowly becoming a graveyard of courage. His comrades, once full of hope and strength, now lay scattered among the ruins, their dreams silenced by the inevitable. Yet in the face of this overwhelming loss, Jack refused to bow. There was still one thing left for him to do: protect his brothers at all costs. He dashed forward, leading the charge himself, drawing the enemy's attention with reckless abandon. Bullets whizzed by, some too close for comfort, but Jack didn't flinch. He wasn't just fighting the enemy anymore. He was fighting against time, fighting against the impossible. Every ounce of his being screamed for him to retreat, to find safety, but Jack refused. His comrades needed him, and he would be damned if he let them fall without a fight. The roar of a distant explosion interrupted his thoughts, snapping him back to the battle at hand. He looked around and saw Private Johnson, the same young soldier he had helped earlier, limping toward him. Blood soaked his uniform, his eyes wide with panic. "Sergeant," Johnson called out, his voice hoarse, We can't hold them off much longer." Jack's heart sank, but his face remained a mask of determination. "We don't need to hold them off, Johnson. We need to fight until they have nothing left to take. We don't stop, not until every last one of us is standing. Understand?" Johnson nodded, the flicker of fear in his eyes replaced by a spark of defiance. Jack grabbed his rifle tighter, the cold metal feeling like an extension of himself. His team was broken, his strength waning, but there was no turning back. This was the moment they had been trained for. This was their duty. Suddenly a figure emerged from the smoke, one of their own, a soldier who had been left behind in the retreat. His face was covered in dirt, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. The soldier's eyes met Jack's, and for a moment, there was a shared understanding. They both knew what had to be done. "Sergeant," the soldier said with a strained breath, "we need to fall back. It's over." Jack's heart twisted. Falling back? They had come this far, only to retreat now. He could feel the weight of that decision gnawing at him, but he could also see the desperation in the soldier's eyes. He was right. They were outnumbered. The line was broken, and if they didn't act now, they would all be wiped out. With a heavy heart, Jack nodded. "Get the others. Now, we make a stand at the ridge." Johnson and the soldier scrambled, their hands trembling as they gathered the remaining men. Jack took one last glance at the battlefield, his eyes scanning the wreckage. the lives lost, the hope extinguished. And then he turned, leading the last few survivors toward the ridge. As they moved, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed. His men were counting on him, but the reality of the situation was cruel. There would be no rescue. There would be no salvation. They were on their own. But Jack had learned long ago that sometimes the most you can do is fight with everything you have left. When they reached the ridge, Jack took a moment to look out over the battlefield, his heart heavy with regret. The enemy was close. Their forces were overwhelming. But there, on that ridge, Jack made a promise to himself and his men. He would not let them die in vain, not while he had breath in his lungs. "This is it," Jack said, his voice calm yet firm. "We stand here, and we fight for everything we've lost, everything we've worked for. We fight for each other, and we fight to win." His soldiers nodded, fear replaced with a new sense of purpose. They had come to terms with the reality of their situation, but they still had one thing left to fight for: each other. Jack looked over his shoulder at his men. These were the faces of his brothers in arms, the men he had sworn to protect, the men he had come to love as family. The final wave of the enemy approached, their numbers greater than ever before. But Jack didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was ready to face the storm, ready to give everything for the soldiers by his side. With a battle cry that rang out through the storm, Jack led the charge. The enemy met them with a wall of gunfire, but Jack's men fought with a ferocity that could only come from sheer determination and the knowledge that they were fighting for something far bigger than themselves. Jack's rifle roared in his hands, his every movement a blur of precision. His team was down to their last few rounds, their last moments of strength, but they fought like lions. They fought until their bodies could no longer stand, until their ammunition ran dry. But still, Jack did not stop. He refused to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of gunfire began to fade. The world around Jack became quiet, and for a fleeting moment, he dared to believe they had won. But then, through the haze of smoke and dust, he saw it. The enemy had retreated. They were gone. The battlefield was silent. And Jack, his body battered and broken, stood alone amidst the ruins. His soldiers, his brothers, had given everything they had. And in the end, they had won. Not because of strength, but because of something greater, the unbreakable bond they shared. They had fought until there was nothing left. And in that moment, Jack realized something profound. Even in defeat, there was victory. Because sometimes the greatest battle is not against an enemy. It is the battle to keep going when everything seems lost. As Jack collapsed to his knees exhausted, a single thought crossed his mind. They had stood together, and that was all that mattered.